Well, so today we're going to talk about 8 biases that drive misconceptions in testing. Now, keeping in mind the time that we have and also the misconceptions and the number of biases we've got to deal, I decided to go for a little tweak. And what I have done is I will be talking about biases that drive 8 misconceptions in testing, because there are so many misconceptions, we might just go crazy finishing them all. So I picked up 8 of them, and I'm going to talk about the biases surrounding those 8. So I'm going to begin by making a statement. Everyone is biased. I am biased. You are biased. We all are biased. Yes, everyone is biased. But before any of you just unmute yourself and says, hey, how can you make that statement? Let me clarify what I mean by bias. A bias is a prejudice that we have for someone or something that makes us favor something or someone. And it can be shown in the form of a behavior. It can be shown in the form of an action. It can be shown in the form of a habit that we have. So all of us have biases, especially, we might favor our family. We might have biases for our children, for our siblings, for our friends, or for certain situations or certain beliefs in the society. So all of us are actually biased. Now, from where do these biases come in? Well, the population of the world is around 7.85 billion, which means that there are 7.85 billion opinions around us. Opinions that are in sync with us, opinions that are contradictory to ours, opinions that may challenge us sometimes, may cause disruptions. Opinions drive societies. Opinions drives misconceptions, and opinions drive biases. There are many misconceptions in testing. Let's look at some of them and let's see what are the biases around them. The common misconceptions in testing, like I said, I've picked 8 of them. There are many more. So these are the top 8 according to me. Number 1, testing is easy. Anyone can test. Haven't we heard this many, many times? Next one, development is better than testing. Well, go and ask any student in the final year of engineering in a college in India, and they will tell you this. Testing is not technical. Testers are not technical. Well, because there is a comparison with development, so it is deemed that testing or testers are not technical enough. Testing comprises of writing test cases and executing them. So if you mark a few test cases, pass or fail, if you put in a defect or 2, then your testing is done. It's not a big deal. Automation is the one-stop solution for all problems. If you automate, it will solve all your problems. If you have got good automation skills, you are an expert in testing. We hear that a lot these days. Look at the job descriptions around us. Manual testing has no future. Well, we've been hearing this for a long, long time, and probably we'll hear this for a few more years. And finally, if something fails in production, it is the tester's fault. Well, having said this, having spoken about these 8 misconceptions, let's look at each one of them one by one and see what are the biases that are causing people to talk like this, and then what is the reality behind that misconception. But before I do that, let me talk a little bit about the Cognitive Bias Codex. This is this beautiful picture where it talks about the cognitive biases that we have. There are about 188 of them listed on this. And if you just Google up the Cognitive Bias Codex, you will get this, which is very helpful in knowing the kind of different kinds of biases that people may have. This is very helpful. And especially with testing being a social skill, especially testing involves a lot of psychology. Testing involves a lot of dealing with people. It is important to be aware of these biases and try and get rid of them or get around them. So the first misconception, testing is easy. Anyone can test. Well, we've heard that numerous times. It's people would say, hey, what do you testers do? You just come, you just take the application, do a few clicks here and there, and you're all set. Well, I don't think that is the case. But what is causing people to say this is something called as confirmation bias. People have a tendency to cherry pick information that is consistent with their beliefs. So back in the day when we used to have the concept of looking at black box testing and white box testing, of course we still do have those concepts. So testing was purely seen as a black box activity where people were not looking into the code, people were not looking inside as to what is going on. Okay, people were looking at the feature and they were clicking and they were trying to perform certain actions and trying to see. But that is something that has caused a perception to be built that, oh, testers do a very easy job. They just click around here and there and it's no big deal. And that's why there was this perception built where people said anyone can test. But that is not true. Testing is about a mindset. Testing is about creativity. Testing needs a lot of skill. Testing needs critical thinking. It is, yes, you may say that anybody can follow instructions. Okay, but everybody cannot test. You can give a set of instructions to somebody and say, hey, follow these steps, click on this, go to this screen, fill this data. And then you may say, hey, you see, anybody can do the test. But can you apply creative thinking? Can you apply your logic? Can you apply critical analysis? That is the key. And that is what testers do. Excuse me. The next one, development is better than testing. Well, from very early days, there has been a comparison with development. Oh, development is a creative activity. Testing is a destructive activity. Testers break software. Developers make software. Developers use so many tools. They know so many languages. Testers don't need to know those tools. Testers don't need to know those languages. So, development is always considered to be better. Look at the salary ranges of developers versus the salary ranges of testers. So there is always this comparison. When people have this tendency of believing in the first piece of information as the ultimate truth, then these sort of misconceptions creep in. Let's look at the reality. Can development exist without testing? No, it can't. Can we test something which hasn't been developed? No, we can't. They are both the sides of the same coin. They go hand in hand and should never be compared. Testing requires a different approach. Development requires a different approach. The skills required to be a developer are different from the skills that are required to be a tester. So there should be no comparison. Testing is not technical. Testers are not technical. Well, again, going back to the previous one where people say that development is a creative activity or development is something where they need to make something and testers need to break something. Well, that's the toughest part, and that's where all this misconception creeps in. Well, this is a tendency to believe information selectively based on fixed views. So some people believe that this is true. Some people believe that testers don't need technical skills, and that has been propagated over years and years, and that's why the sort of perception has built. But now, if you look around, testing also requires a lot of technical knowledge. You need to know the technical stack of the product that is being built. You need to know the architecture. You need to understand how things work together. You need to understand how the system behaves under certain conditions. And for that, you are equally technical, if not more, compared to a developer. Also, if you are testing that particular software then you use certain tools, certain techniques, which the developers do not use. So there may be cases where you are probably more technical. So basically, the point is that the comparisons that we do between developers and testers need to stop. And one needs to understand that that testing is as technical as development. Moving on. Testing comprises of writing test cases and executing them. Well, there is an obsession for writing test cases. People are obsessed about writing test cases. They think, oh, if they write test cases, then they are showing how productive they are. Test cases are seen as something tangible, something really that can measure the productivity of people. And not surprisingly, appraisals are being done on the basis of number of test cases that are written by individuals. Testing is not about passing or failing, or not just about passing or failing of certain test cases or putting some defects. Testing is also about discovering the unknown. Testing is about experimenting. Testing is about designing those experiments which may pass, which may fail, which may lead you to a different approach, which may tell you some things that you had never imagined, which you had never forecast. So get out of this obsession for test cases. Think of test ideas. Think of test design. Think of ways to design an experiment. Okay, and experiments, you may say experiments pass or fail, or similarly test cases can pass or fail. But experiments also give you thresholds. Experiments also give you results in terms of what is the maximum value, what is the minimum value. It is not a binary result that you always get from your experiments. The same is true for testing. So stop this obsession about test cases and focus on the real testing activity. Now, why this misconception prevails is because of the tendency to believe false information. So initially, when people had these checklists and they used to do pass, fail, that carried on, and people used to do it, and that was a practice that was repeatedly done. And then came in ISTQB, which said, okay, you need to write, test cases, test conditions, test steps, and then it became a norm that people followed that logic. But how far is that true? Companies have been repeating that over and over. People have been repeating that over and over. How far is that true? One has to ask these questions. One has to understand that, okay, while we are talking about testing, why are we just sticking to test cases? One has to understand this. Also, there is a tendency of people saying, well, this is how it works in my company, so I do just that. That is called as system justification bias. You are trying to justify what is there in the system without questioning it. That is not the ultimate truth. That may not be the right path. If something is being done for a certain number of years, it does not mean, or it does not prove that that is the ultimate truth. One has to understand that. If there was a time when people used to follow checklists for marking tests pass or fail, then things have changed. The software has changed. The way it is getting developed has changed. So the way it is getting tested should also change. Testing is about curiosity. Testing is about creativity. Testing is about collaboration. You talk to people. Testing is about communicating the results that you've got from your testing to the stakeholders so that they can take meaningful decisions. These are the key ingredients of testing and not test cases. So once again, get over the obsession for test cases. Focus on testing. Let's look at the next one. Automation is the one-stop solution for all problems. Look at the job descriptions around you. Every one of the job descriptions is full of test automation. And what happens in a lot of cases is people join the company and they are asked to do testing which does not involve any tool, which does not involve any use of automation at all. But everybody is interested in doing automation. This is because of something called as the bandwagon effect. If automation has worked for somebody else, then it is believed that automation will work for me as well. So what I do is, without thinking, without doing a feasibility analysis, without doing a POC, I just jump onto that bandwagon. Yesterday, during their talks, Larissa and Corina, both of them, they mentioned very clearly that you need to do a POC before you get started with automation, that you need to understand what is automatable and what is not. It may be a case where your application is not automatable at all, or you don't need to automate because it is too small. But because everybody is automating, because Facebook is talking about an automated CI/CD pipeline, I should have the same. Look at how much money Facebook is making. Maybe I can make that much money at the end of it all. But also look at the fact that Facebook notifications do not work. So that is something that we need to understand. If something works for somebody, it doesn't mean that it will work for us as well. We have to be judicious. We have to think that, it is not a magic wand. If it has worked for somebody, it may or may not work for me. I will need to take my steps very carefully. If you have got good automation skills, you are an expert in testing. We are seeing that a lot of late. Again, going back to the same point, look at the job descriptions. People ask only for automation skills. You will struggle really hard to find any testing skills in the job description. A few days ago, there was a job description which said, okay, knowledge of tool A, tool B, tool C. And it was mentioned as skill. That is not skill, that is just a tool. What do you want the tester for? What does the tester need to do? What does the tester need to test? There was no description. That is because there is too much focus on automation. So it is a case of inattentional blindness where there is too much focus on automation and the basic fact is forgotten. And the basic fact is that test craftsmanship is the precursor to test automation. Also, people talk a lot about automation skills because of the perceived benefits that they see. They see that, okay, automation testers are paid higher than others. So, okay, let me do automation. Let me learn a few languages. Let me learn a few tools. I will start getting paid more. That is a perceived benefit. But does it mean that you are good at testing? Probably not. Because the basic testing knowledge, the basic testing skills is what you need as the foundation on top of which you build your automation skills. Without a foundation, every building is set to crumble. That is something that we need to remember. Once again, test craftsmanship is a precursor to test automation. Do not forget that. Do not lose sight of the basics. Focus on the basics. It's a perfect idea for you to add automation skills, but do not lose sight of the basics. Manual testing has no future. This is, in my opinion, the weirdest one of all, because when you talk about manual testing, it does not exist. And when something does not exist, why are you talking about its future? But we have been hearing this for a long time. People have been talking about manual testing not having any future. What they probably mean is testing has no future. But what they have narrowed it down to it being manual testing has no future because there is this big beast called automation. So there is this comparison, okay, anything that does not use a tool is probably manual, which is bizarre logic according to me. First thing, there is there should not be any comparison or distinction in testing as manual or automation just on the basis of the way you execute your checks or your tests. If your test idea needs the use of a tool, make use of it. If your test idea does not need the use of a tool, then don't use it. But stop classifying it as a manual activity or an automation activity. We are not in the manufacturing industry. We are not in an industry where we are talking about manual labor. Well, the common problem behind this misconception is something called as the ostrich effect, where people just don't want to hear anything bad being spoken about automation. Or if I say, hey, you know what, you are using tools, but probably this is something that does not need tools. Oh, so you mean you want to do it manually? Is the response that will come back. I mean, I just said that you don't need tools. I did not say that you have to put your blood and sweat behind it. If that is what you are meaning by manually, because that is what normally happens in the heavy labor industry, where you actually have manual labor, where there is a lot of effort going into it. The fact is that there is nothing called manual testing. Yes, if you're talking about testing not having any future, and if you are trying to say, okay, because of technologies such as artificial intelligence, testing has no future, well, then I have news for you. The artificial intelligence will also need to be tested. So you cannot say that testing does not have future. Every AI will need to be tested. You will need testers. Testing will always have a future. The eighth one, and this is probably my favorite one because I have heard this so many times during my career. If something fails in production, it is the tester's fault. How many times do we hear that? That this wasn't tested properly. Catch hold of the testing team. Immediately there is a blame game that begins. And people tend to rely on the only available piece of information, and that is that there is a production bug. They do not want to dig deep. They do not want to do a root cause analysis. They do not want to ask fundamental questions. Like, for example, what is the requirement for which this bug has been found? Was the requirement discussed with development and testing at the same time, or was it relayed from one team to the other? Were there any risks that were identified while that requirement was being discussed? What were the mitigation steps that were put in place? So it is not just that the testers are responsible for that bug in production. It is everybody who is involved in the game. And the reason for that is quality is everyone's responsibility. So the bug in production is everyone's fault. If you are bent upon finding a fault for that, then it is everybody's failure. You cannot blame it on the testers alone. Well, with that said, we've spoken enough about the misconceptions. Now let's see how, and the biases, let's see how we can come out. Number one, ask questions. Whenever you hear or read a piece of information, ask questions about it. You have got to bring out the questions in a manner so that you get absolute answers. It cannot be something thrown in thin air. Test the assumptions. If people say, let's assume, do not assume. Testers do not assume. Testers test the assumptions. And most importantly, learn and be aware. Learning, self-learning and awareness are the best way to get out of these misconceptions, to get out of these biases. With that, I want to thank you all for attending this session and being very patient in listening to me. This is how you can contact me. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. with my profile. You can also get in touch with me on the Beround company page. You can also connect with me on the Test Chat Telegram group or get in touch with me on Twitter. Thank you. If the questions. In terms of job opportunity, career progression, and overall compensation, why do you think developers are at a higher advantage than testers? Well, this division of development being better than testing and development being more skillful than testing started many years ago, and it'll probably take an entire generation to get rid of these, and that's where this gap in compensation has been there. So, but now the gap is narrowing down because people have realized that testing is a much stronger skill. And if you look at the average salaries of late, they are much closer to each other. So developers and testers are paid almost similar. In some places, testers even do get higher salaries compared to developers. For example, NASA. Okay. I personally feel acceptance of testing in any workplace is changing the mindset first. In your experience of 2 decades, how have you seen the mindset of the people change towards testing? Well, of course, this is a very good question, Mihir. Well, it is very important for us testers to realize that, it is, first of all, it is up to us to be able to help change the mindset. People talking about it, people having these biases, prejudices, will always have a different perception. But what happens a lot of times is that the mindset of testers need to come out. So you need to be on your toes always. You need to be asking questions. You need to be putting that pressure back and saying, hey, you know what? This is not just the right way. I'm here to help improve the software. I'm here to improve the quality of the software. I'm here to work with you. Once you've given that confidence to the developers, once you start involving them in your day-to-day activities, for example, when you're building a test strategy, it is not an activity for just a test lead or a test manager to do. You've got to involve everybody, including the developers. And that is where the acceptance will come in about testers. They say, oh, these guys are really there to help us. And they will believe in the testing mindset. So that's how I have seen it changing. Yes, people are accepting it. Okay. How can we deal with a situation when managers are more focused on test case numbers instead of good coverage of tests? That's a very tricky one, actually. Well, in simple words, the manager needs more education. So you've got to show them the value of the test case coverage rather than, and when you're talking about coverage, now this is a very interesting one, actually. Talking about coverage, people often tend to stick their neck out and say, oh, you know what? I've achieved this much of test coverage. There is another dynamic to the coverage part of it. People don't talk so much about risks. Testing is about highlighting risks. So highlight the risk coverage along with test coverage. So when you talk about test coverage, it should be a combination of your requirements coverage, your code coverage, and your risk coverage. If you have covered all the three, then your coverage is complete. And when you are able to show this value, then they will not chase you for the number of test cases because that will become the important driver. What about non-technical testers who make their best to make the needed efforts? I don't think any tester is non-technical. I think every tester is technical. Every tester is making use of technology. If you are trying to imply with non-testing or non-technical testers, if you're trying to imply that somebody who does not know automation, or you need not know automation, it's okay. It's okay. You may not be interested in automation. That's fine. But what you need to focus on is learning the domain. You need to understand that there is a product that you need to test on. Understand how that product works. Understand how what problems are you trying to solve. So, when you talk about non-technical testers, if you are trying to say that, okay, these are some people who don't use tools, then I don't go with that at all. Okay, every tester uses tools. The biggest tool that you have in your possession is your brain. Every tester uses that. So let's not go in the direction of using a particular tool which is commercially available or on the shelf. I mean, that's a very narrow way of thinking. Okay. After third misconception, often find technical is a definition that often varies. How would you define technical? Technical for me is something that involves technology that is being used in the software, technology that is being used in the making of that software, technology that is being used in the testing of that software, technology that is used in bringing that technology to, so bringing that product to the customer. So all of that is a very important aspect of technology. Okay. Have you got any tips for not following your biases? Well, Mark, just keep on asking questions. Ask a lot of questions. I mean, people talk about questioning being something silly. Well, there are no silly questions. There are no stupid questions. Just ask questions. Don't assume anything. Challenge everything that you see. Challenge the status quo. Challenge the system. If it's something is existing and people are saying, no, this is the way it works. No, break that myth. It may not be true. Challenge it. What is the harm in trying? You are a tester. You've got to go out there and test it. Honestly, I think many managers are obsessed with test cases numbers to measure productivity. In some ways, that kills testers' creativity. How can we deal with that? Well, you have to bring out your creative skills in terms of risk analysis. You have to bring out your creative skills in terms of test design. You have to bring out your, and when I say test case design, do not just stick to some of the notes that are there in the ISTQB book. Okay, it only talks about certain test design techniques like BVA, equivalence partitioning. It's not just that. It is much more beyond that. When you talk about test design, you're actually designing the experiment. You're actually designing the test. Okay, I have got to test, for example, for example, WhatsApp application. Okay, easiest thing, everybody uses it. So if I have got to test WhatsApp, then I have to think of the various possibilities. First, okay, WhatsApp is available, on mobile, on desktop. Okay, then what are the dynamics? How is it? How is the configuration? What is the architecture behind it? How does it work? How are the privacy settings? How can I protect my data? How can I make sure that my information is going to the right recipient? Think about the various situations. Think about the risks that you may have. Build around that. Okay. Do you agree that someone who's new to testing with no development background should search for a mentor in order to start learning? Yes, that is a very good idea. Okay. Yes, I would go for it, irrespective of whether you have a dev background or not. Doesn't matter. Mentoring does help. Okay. Look for a mentor. Look for somebody who can really guide you along and be very helpful. Okay. Gaurav asks, fourth misconception, if my organization is into writing test cases, then how to explain to them about not writing those? Well, like I said, I mean, what is the ultimate goal? Quality of the software or number of test cases? Let's put it that way. Okay, if the number of test cases is the ultimate goal, then let's focus on test cases. If your goal is quality, if your goal is in terms of pointing out the risks, then focus on the test ideas that you have, then focus on test design. Okay, if you think that, okay, by measuring somebody's productivity in terms of number of test cases written, number of test cases pass, fail, or sending out an all green Jenkins report will tell you the truth, well, no, it doesn't. Focus on the risks. Well, it's time that you educate your management, maybe. How can you explain things that you explain to management from any company, because of their looking at testing is totally different? Well, that's where the testing education comes in, right? That's where you've got to learn. That's where you've got to be able to show the value of good proper test design. You've got to show the value of good test strategies. You've got to show the value of exploratory testing. You've got to show the value of good skills like risk analysis. You've got to show the value of critical thinking. It is on us. We have to show the management that, all of these are important. Excuse me. Many clients say that they don't have budget for testing. For example, WordPress site. How can we convince them for testing? Well, this is, excuse me. Well, budget is a totally different topic. But what you can begin by showing them is that, that there are problems that the software has, that there are problems that there are there which need to be solved. Okay, and if that budget is somehow made available, then you can add more value. You can start by showing them the risks that are there, okay, which may draw their attention, and in order to mitigate those risks, there is some investment that is required. Non-technical testers who do just black box testing, who do not master the code. Well, not really. I mean, in my opinion, everybody is a technical tester, because testing is essentially a technical skill. You have to test technology. You have to be aware of the tech stack of your product. You have to be aware of the architecture of the product. You have to be aware of how things have been built and how these things can have risks in them, and how do you resolve those risks. So there is a lot that you can focus on, and that's why I believe that testing is essentially a technical skill. Well, with that, I have answered all questions, or there are a couple more which have popped up. In 10 to 15 years from now, how do you believe that we don't need any manual testing at all? So Ronnie, manual testing doesn't exist, number one. Yeah, the role for manual testers might diminish, because it is an expectation that everybody needs to know technology. Everybody needs to understand what it is all about. So the roles will perish, but testing as such will continue to exist. And I use the term testing and not manual testing, because manual testing is not there. It is testing. Okay. How do you make sure that automation code is stable when developers change UI elements very frequently without? That is where you need to collaborate. That is exactly where you need maybe a daily sync up with the developers. We've got to build a culture of trust, Harish. To be very, very frank, it is very important that a culture of trust is built. So, for example, if you are building your test strategy, involve the developers in reviewing your test strategy. If they are putting across any questions on your test cases, discuss this with them. Okay, ask them what strategy do they have for their unit testing. If you can help them, give them ideas, share your test cases with them, because ultimately it's for everybody, right? So that's how you build that level of trust, and that will solve this problem of developers making changes without telling you.